Respected colleagues, thank you for inviting me to participate in this Educamp adventure. And I will do this by participating in this roundtable discussion that focuses on self-regulated learning in virtual learning environments. And I will start with a redefinition of what is actually the problem. And next, I will shift to, looking first at face-to-face learning environments and then shifting to online learning environments and how this affects our opportunities to deal with self-regulated learning. Now, first of all, this problem. Well, self-regulated learning and learning environments, they really interact with the affordances of the specific setting in which we put our students. And these settings have changed, of course, due to COVID-19. For instance, here we see that Aristophanic, he really states that students experience a much larger workload. And though you could say the satisfaction with teaching support is still high, well, it drops mainly below 60 and often even 50%. And also all the support mechanisms they get, they also, in the appreciation of these support mechanisms, see that the satisfaction really drops. And what is the impact of this? Well, the impact is that we are at risk of having students drop out. And we know since decades that, especially when students are expected to study independently, so away from the institution, that we are at risk of dropout. And we have percentage between 20 to 80%. And these are the typical factors that, in fact, are related to dropout. And you clearly see that, depending on your definition, it's the typical regulation mechanisms, so the metacognitive part, but also, in fact, cognitive aspects and motivational aspects. So it means that the moment we move from face-to-face to online to virtual learning environments, we are in trouble. And we also know that predictors of dropouts, when we look, for instance, at learning analytics, that we look really at these aspects that are related to your engagement in the environment, the extent you interact with others, you interact with the materials, the way you spend time in the environment, so your time management issues. So we'll turn to this problem in terms of moving to virtual learning environments will in fact make the position of SRL critical for many students, because this change supposes that students master the competences, master the skills to cope with the environment, and there we have a big question mark. So the first thing we want to stress is that when we look at an existing face-to-face learning environment, many affordances of the typical traditional learning environment in fact support SRL. So you see a very strong investment in time and space constraints. Students have to come to a classroom, they have to come to attend classes, they have to spend time, they listen to clear direction, they interact, so their cognition, their metacognition and motivation is all the time pushed by these traditional way of teaching and learning, and they learn to cope with them. The big question mark is when you move to a virtual learning environment that we are at risk, because we lose all these affordances. Because we give a lot of freedom to students. All of a sudden, the time constraints are gone, the tools are gone, the interaction is at risk, the immediate feedback, the immediate sources for help, the immediate modeling they see from their teachers and peers and support staff, that's all gone. And that's why in many cases we see authors really pushing for stop giving too much freedom. We have to rethink, in fact, these environments. So the big question is, what are now the affordances for virtual learning environments that could compensate for losing all these facilities from the face-to-face environment? And here you see a list of how for each of the affordances that we normally have in a face-to-face setting that we can make choices. And this is but a first list, because the research really helps us to look at all kinds of approaches to support SRL in a virtual learning environment, but it requires an explicit design. And for instance, here we get this overview of Monteiro in the Portuguese setting, and she did in fact a very large review study, and you see that everything that is related to SRL is related to explicit course design, explicit invoking of interaction, explicit building on and developing skills related to, in fact, their knowledge and their strategies and skills in relation to their management of the time, of their monitoring, of their planning, and their evaluation. In another way, we see, for instance, here how in this study we moved from traditional learning to a variety of e-learning environments, and we see, yes, indeed, there is a higher performance when we move to the e-learning based environments, but it all depends. We see, for instance, that blended learning and flipped classrooms, so where you have this mixture of face-to-face and online, is still superior as compared to e-learning, and is to a large extent related to, for instance, the availability of immediate feedback, of direct involvement in guided questions. So in this study, for instance, we compared immediate feedback or delayed feedback, and we immediately see the moment we invest more in the feedback at each stage of the learning process, again, we have a larger, in fact, student performance and motivation. And here we have an international course, in fact, for teachers, university teachers. And in this course, we invested in a very strict planning in terms of time and space. There was no freedom here. Every week you had to do this, the next week that, and this for 6 teams. For each activity, it was a very strict, scripted, step-by-step guide, so that there was no time wasted by looking, what do I have to do? A typical question in online learning environments. The next one is a strong investment, given the available research, in feedback by peers, but also in giving feedback about the feedback to peers and experts. And lastly, you see a lot of group interaction, but all this group interaction was again scripted. The choice for these typical tools, approaches in the virtual learning environment were all based on research evidence. If you pull now everything together, well, we really should be careful. Virtual learning environments, they ask to reconsider and consider SRL. And we have to be aware that all the affordances of the traditional face-to-face environment get lost. So we need to compensate for this. And there are affordances of tools, approaches, aspects of a virtual learning environment that can help to, in fact, compensate for this loss. But it requires discipline, rigor, strict planning. The research underpins this. But the key facet is that for us, teachers, the design of such virtual learning environments will require time, effort, and specific expertise. Thank you.